I've always found solo camping trips a great way to unwind and relax. Yesterday morning, I drove out to some hills nearby and set up my tent in a campsite close to a well-known hiking trail. Since I didn't have any plans for the holidays, I figured camping would be a better choice than staying at home. I also thought the area would be pretty empty, considering the time of year. Turns out I was right, but to my surprise, I was completely alone at the site. The day was peaceful, and I enjoyed myself thoroughly. After a long hike that left me completely drained, I decided to call it an early night. Around 8 p.m., I cleaned up my campsite and crawled into my tent to wind down. I must have fallen asleep pretty quickly, but at around 3:15 a.m., I woke up abruptly to the sound of my tent's zipper being opened very slowly. I'm a light sleeper, especially on trips like these, because I like to stay alert. I always position my head near the tent entrance for situations just like this. As soon as I woke up, I realized someone was trying to get into my tent. Luckily, I always bring a small handgun for protection, though I've only ever used it at the range and never in an actual emergency. My heart started racing, but I stayed calm. Carefully, I grabbed my gun, aimed it at the entrance, and spoke loudly, "I have a gun! You have 5 seconds to leave before I shoot." The silence that followed was unnerving, lasting about 3 seconds, until I heard footsteps quickly running away. I kept my gun pointed at the entrance for what felt like 10 minutes, waiting to hear any other noise. When everything stayed quiet, I grabbed my phone and called the police. They told me they were about 20 minutes away, so I stayed on high alert, ready for anything. When the officers arrived, I stepped out of the tent and explained what had happened. They searched the area and, just about 15 feet away, found someone hiding in a tree. It turned out to be a guy in his early 20s who had taken some kind of hallucinogen at another campsite nearby. He had wandered off, gotten lost, and mistakenly thought my tent was his. The guy looked shaken up, and as the officers cuffed him, he apologized, saying, "I'm so sorry, man, that's my fault." The police asked if I wanted to press charges, but I decided against it. I was frustrated, but I could tell he wasn't trying to harm me. It was just a dumb mistake from someone who was out of it. After everything calmed down, I packed up my gear and left. There was no way I was going to sleep again after an experience like that. When I was younger, I worked as a seasonal wildland firefighter in the southwestern United States. One summer, I was stationed deep in the rugged backcountry of rural New Mexico. The northern part of the forest was a popular spot for outdoor activities, but the southern section, where we were based, was incredibly remote, far from paved roads or any campgrounds. If you wanted to explore there, you had to put in serious effort. Shade was scarce, and the afternoon sun could be brutal. Our fire crew operated out of 2 locations, one in town and another about 2.5 hours away, accessible only via a narrow, winding mountain road. The remote station was a decent setup. It had a fire response building, an old ranger cabin, and a newer trailer where we bunked. This was more than 20 years ago, so cell service was non-existent, leaving us to come up with our own ways to stay entertained. We had a small TV for movie nights and outdoor games like horseshoes to pass the time. With the right team, evenings around the fire pit could feel pretty cozy. This story happened on the night of July 4th. There wasn't an active fire at the time, but with the holiday, we were on edge, not knowing what might happen. That evening, we played horseshoes, listened to music, and enjoyed each other's company. Since we had an early training hike the next morning, there was no alcohol involved, so most of us turned in early. I had my own small room in the trailer, which featured one of the few windows. It overlooked a stretch of wilderness, away from the station. As I was drifting off to sleep, I suddenly heard someone outside my window. It was one of my coworkers, or at least it sounded like him, calling me to come outside. His voice was calm at first, coaxing. Half asleep, I opened my eyes and looked toward the window. It was pitch dark, and I couldn't see anything. The land sloped down steeply on that side of the trailer, which made it even harder to see. But I could hear him clearly. "Come on, man. You need to see this," he said. I didn't answer right away, just stared at the window, trying to process what was happening. Then he spoke again. "Hey, come out here, just for a second." "No," I finally muttered. The tone of the voice immediately changed. It grew sharper, deeper, and angrier. I could feel the tension through the wall. Something inside me told me not to look again. If I did, I was certain I'd see a hand tapping on the glass, beckoning me. But it wouldn't be coming from below, it would be reaching down from above. Whatever it was, it felt unnaturally tall, which is why I couldn't see it through the window. The voice turned to harsh insults and threats, making my heart race. I stayed frozen in bed, sweating and terrified. The tirade went on for what felt like hours before I eventually passed out from exhaustion. The next morning, I told my crew about what happened. Everyone swore they had gone to bed early, and no one had been wandering around outside the trailer. No one else heard or saw anything strange that night. We chalked it up to sleep paralysis or some kind of dream. A few weeks later, while we were back in town, my captain pulled me aside. He swore he hadn't been near my window that night, then shared his own eerie experience. A couple of months before, he'd been camping a few miles from the station, sleeping out in the open without a tent. He and a few others were monitoring for lightning fires in the area. One night, while lying in his sleeping bag, something wet and heavy dripped onto his face. He assumed it was tree sap or bird droppings and tried to wipe it off, but the dripping continued all night. He shone his flashlight into the darkness and even yelled, but nothing responded. Frustrated and uneasy, he moved his bedding to a clearing, away from the trees, but the dripping didn't stop. At first light, he packed up and headed back to the station without saying a word about it. After that, I noticed he stopped volunteering for overnight outdoor assignments, a sharp change for someone who usually jumped at the chance for solo jobs. Neither of us could explain what happened, but we couldn't shake the feeling that our experiences were connected somehow. I had an unusual paranormal experience while camping with some friends near Kalama Falls in Washington State. We were there to celebrate my 14th birthday, and the girls and I had wandered down to the nearby lake for a swim. On the way back to our campsite, we walked alongside a river with a moderately large dam. A few years earlier, there had been a tragic accident where two brothers drowned after being caught in the dam's turbines. The area around the dam was marked with warning signs featuring a skull and crossbones and bold danger messages. After spending some time swimming and playing around, we decided to call it a day and head back. I needed to use the restroom, so my friend stayed at the bottom of the trail while I walked up toward the restrooms. As I approached the entrance, a figure suddenly stepped out from the opposite doorway. It was a boy wearing swimming shorts, water still dripping from him as if he had just been swimming. He stood completely still with no expression on his face. I opened my mouth to greet him, but before I could say anything, he calmly walked past me and headed back toward the lake. I shrugged it off and continued with what I was doing. When I rejoined my friends, I asked if they had seen the boy pass by. They said they hadn't noticed anyone. We stood there for a moment, listening to see if we could hear anything, but there was only silence. We were walking along the river a few hundred feet from our campsite when I saw something strange. A vivid, glowing white figure appeared on the surface of the water. It was a slightly chubby boy who looked about 12 years old, walking atop the river as if the water was solid ground. I stopped and pointed it out to my friends. One of them gasped and said she could see him too, while the other covered her face, saying she was too frightened to look. We stood there for several minutes watching the figure. He walked slowly along the water for about 30 feet before fading away. To me, it didn't seem like he vanished into the trees or air. Instead, it looked like he slipped right through the water's surface. Oddly, he didn't look exactly like the boy I had seen at the restroom earlier, but there were enough similarities that I wondered if they could have been siblings. This remains the most vivid and unforgettable supernatural experience I've ever had. My friend and I decided to explore a challenging canyon trail as a way to celebrate finishing high school. Being naive 19-year-olds, we chose the route purely because it was labeled as extremely difficult. The trail was called the Rockfall Trail, and I'd read somewhere that part of it had been destroyed by a huge landslide. The trek was stunning but utterly draining. We did this in early July when temperatures down in the canyon reached nearly 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Like I said, it was a poorly thought-out adventure by a couple of overconfident teenagers. The last stretch to the canyon's riverbank followed a dried-out stream bed, which we mistook for Drybrush Creek. As we maneuvered around some large rocks, we finally approached the water. We hadn't encountered another person the entire journey, so we were pretty laid back as we hiked. When we reached the river, we stumbled upon a man who immediately stood out. He looked like what you'd imagine from an old Western movie, likely in his late 20s or early 30s, with long black hair, a faded denim shirt tucked into his jeans. He reminded me of someone straight out of a film, maybe like a character you'd see in Young Guns if you've ever watched that. For a moment, I wondered if we'd accidentally wandered onto a film set. As we moved closer, he seemed completely unaware of our presence, staring off into the distance. Eventually, he noticed us and gave a brief nod. We nodded back, and that's when we realized what he was doing. He was tossing a small, bright ball like a racquetball into the rushing water. The current carried it downstream a short distance before it hit a rock. But here's the weird part. Instead of just bouncing off and floating away, the ball launched back into the air and landed perfectly in his hand. At first, it seemed like a simple trick, but the more I watched, the more it felt almost otherworldly. He repeated the action so effortlessly that it felt like I was witnessing something supernatural. Then I noticed something strange about him. It wasn't just his clothes. It was his whole appearance. We'd been hiking through a dusty, bone-dry canyon for miles, yet this guy was spotless, not a speck of dust or dirt on him. And despite the blistering heat, easily over 110 degrees Fahrenheit, he wasn't sweating at all. No stains, no beads of perspiration, nothing. The whole situation was starting to feel surreal. Exhausted from the hike, we just wanted to find a spot to set up camp. We said a quick hello and goodbye, and he returned the greeting before continuing to walk downstream. We headed upstream and never saw him again. It wasn't until much later that we started questioning what we'd seen. How had he known the ball would react that way? Not just how he pulled off the trick, but how he even knew it was possible. We didn't sleep well that night, but nothing else unusual happened after that encounter. Several states, including New Mexico and others across the country, have outdoor youth programs known as wilderness therapy. In the summer of 1993, I participated in one such trek, a 61-day journey through the rugged terrain of the Gila National Forest. Our group consisted of teenagers, many of us considered troubled or rebellious. This was an isolated experience where all our energy and attention were directed toward daily survival. During the entire 2-month trip, we only encountered other people once, and it happened early in the journey. At that time, this was the most remote location I had ever visited, with no signs of civilization for at least 70 miles in any direction. On one particular stretch of the trek, our group was navigating through a canyon using a waterway called Crystal Creek to find our way. This area was incredibly challenging, with no established trails or campsites. The canyon was a slot canyon, meaning its walls were nearly vertical on both sides, and the creek itself was filled with boulders and other tricky obstacles, making progress painstakingly slow. One afternoon, as we made our way through the canyon, some of us spotted a suitcase perched on a rock above the water. It was balanced in a way that suggested someone had intentionally placed it there. We managed to retrieve it from the ledge and opened it. Inside, we discovered women's clothing, wigs, high heels, and some cans of soda along with non-perishable food items like stew and chili. We were puzzled, as there were no roads or trails for miles around. Our guides speculated that the suitcase might have fallen from an aircraft. However, upon closer inspection, the exterior of the suitcase was completely intact. If it had fallen from thousands of feet onto the rocky canyon floor, it would have been heavily damaged, yet there wasn't a single dent or scratch. Another theory was that a flood during the monsoon season might have carried the suitcase downstream from a campsite and left it where we found it. But the suitcase was sitting atop a rock about 7 or 8 feet above the water. It wasn't waterproof, and everything inside was in perfect condition, suggesting it hadn't been through a flood. We ultimately left the suitcase where it was and chalked it up to an unsolved mystery. Who would bring wigs, dresses, and high heels in a suitcase to such an inaccessible location? The thought unsettled all of us. What sticks with me the most are the cans of food. It made me wonder if someone had deliberately placed the suitcase there as part of some plan. Maybe an attempt to disappear in the summer of 1993. The whole incident continues to haunt me to this day. Back when I was a teenager in high school, a group of my friends and I decided to camp in a very secluded area deep in the hills. Reaching the spot required a serious off-road vehicle. It was about 35 miles along an extremely rugged path. There were river crossings, large rocks scattered across the trail, and plenty of sandy patches. Calling the place remote would be an understatement. The drive took us the entire day, and during that time, we didn't see a single person. No one passed us, and we didn't spot any other campers. One of my friends pointed out that it seemed like the trail hadn't been used in a long time, which felt odd since this was in Utah, a state where trails like this are usually bustling with outdoor enthusiasts. It's worth noting that the path led to a box canyon, which is essentially a dead end surrounded by towering cliffs. The road we were on was the only way in and out, and cell phone reception was at least 20 miles away. By evening, we finally reached the campsite and began setting up. One of our traditions whenever we went camping was playing Capture the Flag, and this trip was no different. We waited for darkness to fall before starting the first round. During the second round, one of my teammates and I decided to hop onto the road, which ran alongside the area where we were playing. We thought it would be a good shortcut to reach the other team's flag. While walking along the road, we noticed a faint light heading toward us. At first, we assumed it was another vehicle entering the canyon, but as it got closer, we realized it wasn't a car at all. It was a young woman holding up a phone, seemingly searching for a signal. She was still a little way off, but we could see she looked distressed. She was moving quickly but clumsily, as though she was in a panic. It didn't seem like she was drunk. It was something else entirely. We called out to her, "Hello." No response. It wasn't like she was ignoring us. It felt more like she didn't even notice we were there. We tried again. "Hey, are you all right?" Still nothing. As she got closer and passed by us, we saw that she was crying. Once more we asked, "Are you okay?" But she just stumbled past us, never once acknowledging our presence. The entire time, her focus remained on her phone as she desperately searched for a signal. My friend and I stood frozen, watching her disappear around a bend in the road. She was still stumbling, still crying. When she was out of sight, we called everyone back to camp and told them what we had seen. I'll admit we were shaken. It seemed like she might need help, but the whole situation felt so eerie that we decided to stay in camp for the night and look for her in the morning. The next day, we set out first thing. We thought maybe there were other campers further down the road who might know her. We walked to the very end of the trail but found no sign of anyone. Confused, we decided to check the entrance to the road, hoping we might see her there. After another long drive back to the canyon's entrance, we still didn't find a single trace of her. To this day, I feel guilty for not trying harder to help her, but the whole situation remains a mystery. How did she end up in such a remote location? She didn't seem like someone out hiking. She was wearing ordinary jeans and a light sweater, with no backpack or supplies. If she'd entered the canyon from another direction, it would have required specialized climbing gear, which she clearly didn't have. We were fairly certain no one else had driven down that road in a long time, so the idea of someone dropping her off didn't make sense either. And yet, there she was, holding her phone up as if she thought she'd find reception in a place where it was impossible. My friends and I never saw her again, and we've returned to that campsite several times over the years. That trip, however, remains unforgettable for all of us. My boyfriend at the time and I decided to go camping about 5 hours from our city for his birthday, which was close to our anniversary. We planned the trip the day after a major storm had passed through. We left early in the morning and reached the campground by early afternoon, giving us plenty of daylight to pick a nice spot and set up. The guy at the campground entrance mentioned we were the only ones there that weekend. "This is going to be amazing," my boyfriend said, and I agreed. We drove down long dirt paths to our assigned campsite. As we got closer, the road narrowed and ended abruptly, meaning we'd have to reverse all the way out if we wanted to leave. There was no quick exit. We unloaded the car, set up the tent, and decided to explore the woods. It was eerily quiet, but since it was still bright out, we enjoyed the calm and soaked in the nature. After walking a few miles, we stumbled upon these strange white cabins. They all looked identical, almost like they were mass-produced. It felt odd being there, like we had entered a place we didn't belong. The cabins had this sterile, unnatural vibe that didn't fit the outdoors. Unnerved, we turned around and headed back to the campsite. After catching our breath in the tent, we tried starting a fire in the fire pit. Neither of us had ever been camping before, so we were clueless about how to build a proper fire. We'd brought self-lighting logs from a store and some lighter fluid, but everything was still damp from the storm. Finding dry kindling was a challenge. That's when I realized how unprepared we were for the wilderness. Fresh from a storm, with no real supplies and no backup plans. Eventually, we managed to get a small fire going, roasted some hot dogs and marshmallows, and spent a while stargazing. It was stunning but unsettling just how dark it got out there. My boyfriend, who wasn't fond of the dark, said, "Can we go inside the tent now?" We put the fire out and got into the tent, chatting quietly. I could tell he was nervous. Suddenly, he froze, put his hand over my mouth, and whispered, "Did you hear that?" Before I could reply, we both heard heavy footsteps nearby. It sounded like multiple people walking around. "It's probably just animals," I whispered, but we soon heard low murmuring. It didn't sound like animals at all. It was like voices, only muffled. We sat there in complete silence, staring at each other in the dark. The murmurs grew louder, as did the footsteps, until it seemed they were right outside the tent. Neither of us moved or even breathed. I kept hoping it was a drunk hiker stumbling by, but then I remembered the man at the entrance had said we were alone in the campground. For a moment, I thought maybe it was the ranger checking on us, but that didn't make sense either. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. We waited in silence, unsure how much time passed. Finally, my boyfriend whispered, "We need to get to the car." Adrenaline kicked in, and I peeked out of the tent into the pitch-black night. Telling him to stay behind me, we sprinted to the car. Once inside, I locked the doors and he said, "What the heck was that?" There's no one else here. I scanned the area but saw no signs of life. Stay here, I told him. I'll grab our stuff. I hopped out, grabbed the cooler, and tossed it into the back seat. As I turned to get the tent, I heard those same heavy footsteps again, getting closer. In a panic, I yanked the tent out of the ground, wrapped it in the tarp, and threw it into the trunk. Without a word, I climbed back into the car and asked, "Do we have everything?" "Yes," he said, and I slowly backed the car out. Reversing in the dark was nerve-wracking, especially since the road was narrow. At a fork in the path, we got confused. He couldn't remember which way we had come, so we picked a random direction and ended up in another campsite. Frustrated, I reversed again and finally spotted a small sign hidden behind some bushes that pointed us back to the main road. As we drove away, I noticed a faint green light in the woods near where our site had been. It reminded me of the logs we'd brought. The outer paper burned green when they first caught fire. Someone seemed to be using them now. We drove the entire 5 hours back to town. Arriving at his parents' house around 4 a.m. exhausted, we collapsed on their couch. Neither of us ever talked about that trip again, and I haven't gone camping since. A few friends and I planned a weekend trip to the woods. What made this trip unforgettable were two unsettling events that only happened to me. Both incidents involved what I thought was one of my friends and my frequent need to visit the restroom. The first incident occurred late at night. Everyone was gathered around the fire when I decided to take a short walk to the campground facilities about a quarter-mile away. The moonlight and nearby campers provided enough visibility, so I felt safe venturing into the forest alone. Reaching a fork in the trail, I noticed one path led to an abandoned campsite. In the dim light, I could make out a worn fire pit in the middle of the clearing. For some reason, I couldn't look away. A sense of unease kept me frozen. That's when I saw it, a person stepping out from the trees. As they moved closer, their walk struck me as odd, almost unnatural. They shuffled through the undergrowth until they emerged onto the trail, just ahead of me. I squinted, and my fear briefly subsided. It was one of my friends from camp. I recognized them by their distinct way of walking, but something was off. Why were they wandering through the wrong campsite? And how had they gotten ahead of me when walking was such a struggle for them? Convinced it was a joke, I called out, "What are you doing?" I told everyone I was going to the restroom. They whispered back, "Stop following me." Their voice sounded familiar but distorted, like a bad imitation. I tried catching up, but no matter how fast I walked, they stayed the same distance ahead. It didn't make sense. My friend had difficulty walking, yet they moved effortlessly now. Just as I reached the restroom, they vanished into the shadows. After finishing up, I headed back to camp. To my surprise, I found the same friend sitting by the fire where they'd been earlier. Everyone swore they hadn't left the campsite, insisting I must have been alone. I brushed it off as a weird joke. The second event happened around 3 a.m. Everyone was asleep, and the fire had burned out. I needed to relieve myself again, but this time, I decided to use a nearby tree instead of trekking back to the bathrooms. As I was finishing, I heard the faint sound of a tent zipper behind me. Glancing back, I saw the same friend standing in the clearing. They were trying to light a cigarette, and in the brief spark from the lighter, I caught a glimpse of their face. Their dark eyes were locked on me in a way that sent chills down my spine. They finally lit the cigarette, took a drag, and asked, "Can you hear me?" Their voice was muffled, like it was underwater. Confused, I nodded. Again, they asked, "Can you hear me?" This time, their voice was louder but still distorted. "Yeah, what's going on?" I replied, my voice shaking. The third time they asked, their voice became so loud it was paralyzing, as if the sound itself had weight. I couldn't move or speak. When they finally turned away and stumbled toward the cars parked nearby, I snapped out of it. Thinking it was another prank, I followed them around the vehicle. But when I got there, no one was in sight. The lot was completely empty, with no sign of a cigarette, not even its smell. I returned to camp to find their tent zipped shut, their boots sitting neatly outside, and the sound of them snoring from inside. The next morning, I decided not to mention it, assuming they'd bring it up if it was a prank. But no one said a word. My name is Max, and I live in New Zealand. In the southern part of the country lies the Otago region, home to vast, rugged wilderness with alpine peaks and hidden valleys. This area, known as the backcountry, is remote and can only be accessed by off-road vehicles, often taking days to traverse. It's a favorite destination for adventurers, hunters, and hikers alike. My partner, Sarah, and I decided to go camping there to escape the noise of everyday life. Being away from phone signals and distractions was just what we needed. We packed our SUV, double-checked our supplies, and ensured the vehicle was in good shape. Extra fuel was strapped to the roof, and we informed the nearest ranger station about our trip, a common safety practice in these parts. Our chosen destination was Mataka Valley, a remote, amphitheater-like basin surrounded by towering peaks, with a river winding through its floor. After a full day's drive, we reached the final stretch, a rugged descent into the valley. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, we set up camp near the river under a canopy of beech trees. Being midweek in the off-season, we were confident we had the valley to ourselves. That night, after dinner by the fire, we crawled into our sleeping bags and quickly drifted off. Sometime during the night, I awoke to a sharp noise. I listened closely but heard nothing else. Dismissing it, I rolled over, only to be startled again moments later by what sounded like something falling off our camp table. I figured it must be possums or stoats, common nuisances in the area. Regretting that we hadn't tidied up properly after dinner, I went back to sleep. The next morning, I crawled out of the tent and was immediately struck by a strange feeling. Something was off. The chairs we'd left by the fire were moved. One was now near the table. On the table lay a loaf of bread that I distinctly remembered packing away. Approaching it, I noticed a piece with a bite taken out, the teeth marks unervingly clear. "Did you get up before me and eat this?" I asked Sarah. She shook her head, confused. Together, we combed through our belongings. Nothing was missing, but when I checked the vehicle, I found footprints near the front, where the hood was. The rest of the camp was grassy, but this patch of dirt made the prints stand out. They weren't mine or Sarah's. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe the prints were old, left by someone who camped here before. Yet neither of us wanted to admit the unnerving possibility that someone had wandered through our campsite in the night. Despite our unease, we decided to stay, reasoning that my hunting rifle provided some level of security. After breakfast, I ventured to an old homestead ruin about a kilometer away, a relic from the 19th century when settlers grazed cattle in the valley. The place was steeped in eerie lore, including an unsolved murder from 1919. After taking a few photos, I started back toward camp. Halfway there, I saw Sarah hurrying across the field toward me, visibly shaken. She explained that while washing dishes by the river, she glanced up and saw a man on the opposite bank watching her from the bushes. He was older, scruffy, and wore tattered clothes. The moment their eyes met, he turned and melted into the dense forest. We couldn't understand how anyone could be on that side of the river. It was nearly impassable wilderness. Hoping to make sense of it, we drove the length of the valley, checking every campsite. We saw no vehicles, no fires, nothing to suggest anyone else was there. As evening fell, we returned to camp, deeply unsettled. After dinner, Sarah needed to use the portable toilet we'd set up a short distance away. I accompanied her, not wanting her to go alone. On our way back, we froze. Near our campsite stood a man, old, scruffy, and dressed in patched-up clothes, barely a meter from the rifle leaning against the table. "Evening, mate," he said casually, holding a piece of carved antler in one hand. His coat was fastened with buttons that appeared to be made of bone. Sarah clung to me, trembling. I greeted him cautiously, edging toward the rifle. He explained he'd been coming to this valley for decades and had seen us arrive the previous evening. After a brief and tense conversation, he turned and walked off into the night without a flashlight, disappearing into the dark wilderness. That was enough for us. We packed up in a hurry, ignoring the risks of navigating the treacherous tracks at night. As we drove out of the valley, we didn't see any other camps or vehicles. It was as if we had truly been alone, or should have been. Back home, we shared the story with friends. One of them mentioned hearing about a mysterious figure known as the Bone Man, a hermit who roams the backcountry, crafting tools and buttons from animal bones. Some believe he's harmless. Others link him to unsolved disappearances in the area. We haven't been back to Mitaka Valley since. The beauty of the backcountry no longer feels worth the unease of what or who might be out there.